Could you live in a tiny house? I mean really tiny, between 64 and 300 square feet. These small structures have been called economical, environmentally friendly, sustainable, and cute. Today on Vermont Edition, we'll explore the tiny house movement and why people choose to downsize so drastically. Also on the program, a live performance from the indie rock band Chamberlain, local musicians making a big splash.
Hi, I'm Rick Singari, a producer of Vermont Edition. You can keep in touch with top stories in Vermont with Newslink, a daily email digest. Go to vpr.net for details. Now, here's the program.
This is Vermont Edition. I'm Jane Lindholm. The tiny house movement is far from minuscule. People are using tiny houses as vacation homes, guest cabins, offices, and, of course, as their primary residences. Tiny houses, which are generally between 64 and 300 square feet, have become appealing because they're much cheaper to build and to maintain. There are Vermonters living in tiny houses, celebrating tiny houses, and teaching others how to design tiny houses. Websites devoted to this house scene have also sprung up, and one of the most popular is run by Derek Diedrichsen, who has an off-the-grid home in the Northeast Kingdom. Earlier this month, 20 people from around the country made the trek to his property for Tiny House Summer Camp, where they learned how to build a house of their own. So to kick off our Tiny House show, John Kalish has this report.
35-year-old Derek Diedrichsen lives outside of Boston, where he scavenges building supplies, writes a blog called RelaxShacks.com, and produces Tiny Yellow House, a popular web video series. The web videos are sort of like Wayne's World meets This Old House.
Welcome to another edition of the show where today we'll be showing you how to make no cash stained glass.
Diedrichsen is a 6-foot, 4-inch rock drummer and father of 2. He delights in collecting discarded material and incorporating it in the microstructures he assembles in his suburban backyard, much to the good-natured chagrin of his next-door neighbor, who appears in one of the Tiny Yellow House videos.
Diedrichsen, when are you going to clean this mess up?
Diedrichsen's book, Humble Homes, Simple Shacks, has made a big splash in the tiny house movement, which is focused on houses 300 square feet or less. He's appeared on a number of cable TV shows devoted to home design and was featured on the front page of the New York Times home section not long ago. The 20 people who journeyed to Diedrichsen's 10-acre spread near Orleans in the Northeast Kingdom this month were all fans of the wisecracking tiny house evangelist. All of them refer to him by his nickname, Deke.
I'm just trying to give people an opportunity to develop some hands-on skills. You can read books or watch videos on YouTube till you fall unconscious, and you're not going to really learn the skills that you would just doing it.
The tiny house summer campers were quite familiar with the various outbuildings on Diedrichsen's Northeast Kingdom property, thanks to his blog and videos. 2 teenage brothers from Madison, Connecticut were dropped off by their mother and stayed in a log cabin that belongs to a neighbor of Diedrichsen's known as Uncle Bob. Here's 17-year-old Maxwell Sims.
We're in the loft. We're sleeping with a black bear rug that watches us at night. It's an interesting living arrangement. Weird debris all over the floor. A strange smell, but it's good.
The weird debris turned out to be the putty used to fill the space between the cabin's logs. Sims and his kid brother shared the cabin with Kathy Flynn, a schoolteacher from Falmouth, Massachusetts. Her home abuts a forest, and she plans to build a tree house near it as a little retreat.
I do meditation, and just wanted to get a little bit closer to the birds and to the sky.
A father and his teenage son came all the way from Oakland, California for Tiny House Summer Camp. 15-year-old Willem Smith Clark does wood turning back home.
I'm not some super hardcore DIY person, but once I'm done with college, if I do end up going to college, I'll hopefully find a cool place to live and build a tiny house for myself.
He and his dad, Jeff Clark, stayed in a treehouse during the 4-day workshop.
He's been obsessing about Deke's website for quite some time, and he's got the book, and he pores over the book, and he started to build some things in our basement, and so I thought he's reasonably committed to it. I can see that Willem is really happy doing this. He's engaged in all aspects of the project. So it's thrilling for me to see how much he's learning here.
Now that this is all level, we're going to put about 5 nails in each of these ends here. Once we put the flooring and things like that on, it's going to further tie everything together. So these boards are going to be less likely to pull away.
The participants at Tiny House Summer Camp built 2 structures. The larger of the 2 was just 8 feet by 10 feet. A professional carpenter from the Adirondacks helped Diedrichsen supervise the construction. Both hand tools and power tools run off gas generators were used. One of the participants already owns a tiny house. 62-year-old Jan Kenny hopes to start a tiny house community in Maine when she retires. She currently lives in a tiny house that sits on a trailer parked on a friend's property outside of Philadelphia.
It's basically off the grid, and it is the most peaceful place in the world. I have no TV. I am hooked to Wi-Fi for the internet, and I have found that without all of the stuff that I had, I feel completely free. If I wanted to move, all I would do was batten down the hatches and sort of box things up that are in the house, since that's all I own, and could go anywhere.
3 of the Vermonters at Tiny House Summer Camp are keen on the idea of building a tiny house and putting it on a trailer because the structure would be deemed a recreational vehicle and thus exempt from property tax. Keith Williams is a 57-year-old business consultant who lives in Bristol. He says he's been working on a design for his tiny house and is about to start building it.
I haven't found a spot to put it. I've got 2 kids that live down in North Carolina, and I'm thinking maybe I might just move it down there and spend time down there with my daughters and grandkids. The biggest thing for me with it being mobile is being able to just park it someplace and not pay property taxes. I don't want a big mortgage. I don't want a lot of taxes. Hopefully this will help me get there.
Williams figures that no matter where he parks his tiny house on a trailer, he's going to have to build a shed for his collection of guitars and other stringed instruments. Psychotherapist Jonathan Stein is also planning to build a mobile tiny house. Stein is currently living in a tent on a friend's land in Putney while he builds it. He seems to have caught Derek Diedrichsen's zeal for using found construction materials in his project.
If you look at my car out there, it has a small stairway on the roof of the car that I found on the way here on the side of the road. And, my mind's just thinking about this all the time. Everything I see on the side of the road, I'm thinking, wow, I could use that for the house, in some way or another.
Vermonters can learn how to build a tiny house in weekend workshops given by Bakersfield carpenter Peter King. He's built 27 tiny houses over the last 3 years, including one last weekend near Lake Carmi. Derek Diedrichsen will do another tiny house building workshop at his home outside Boston on the first weekend of November. For VPR News, I'm John Kalish.
Derek Diedrichsen is not the only Vermonter, though, working within the parameters of tiny houses. At Yestermorrow Design Build School in Waitsfield, they're teaching courses in how to construct your own tiny house. We are looking at the tiny house movement today, and you can join the conversation by calling 1-800-639-2211, 1-800-639-2211, or by posting on the Vermont Edition page at vpr.net. We're surprised and pleased to see so many of you already writing in who have an interest in or are already living in tiny houses. So thank you so much for that. Keep them coming. With us now from Yestermorrow is Jose Galarza, Director of Semester Programs. He also teaches a semester-long class at Yestermorrow in which students design and build a real-world project from start to finish in 16 weeks, and it usually is a tiny house. Jose, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here.
We're also joined by Lina Menard, a tiny house aficionado, joining us today from Oregon. She's a Yestermorrow student in the process of overseeing the construction of a tiny house that she actually co-designed, and she's working for a firm building tiny houses this summer. She also lives already in a tiny house and recently led a bicycle tour of tiny houses around Portland. Lina, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Lina, can I ask you first, what does your current house actually look like? How many steps can you take from end to end? How many rooms does it have, or is it one big room? Describe it for us.
Sure. So the tiny house that I live in right now is about 121 square feet. for its footprint. It does have a sleeping loft and a little storage loft, which makes it about 160 square feet. It looks like a little bungalow. In fact, we call it Britt's Bungalow because I'm renting the house from a woman named Brittany who built it a couple of years ago. The house is kind of like a studio apartment on wheels in that it's one great room with little parts that are divided out that enable me to have a kitchen, a bathroom, and kind of a great room area as well as the sleeping loft. So there are a lot of nooks rather than separate rooms.
Lynna, why do you live in a tiny house?
I live in a tiny house for a lot of different reasons. I think that for me, the three biggest are environmental factors. There's less embodied energy in a tiny house. There are fewer materials required to create it. There's also less energy required to heat, cool, and maintain it. I use less water because I'm more aware of my water consumption, and I also am more conscientious about the other things that I purchase because I just don't have a lot of room. A second reason is economic. For me, it's fairly affordable to live in a tiny house, and it helps me to really focus on my priorities. And another big one for me anyway, and I know for a lot of other tiny house dwellers as well, is simplicity. By living in a small space that's very well designed, I'm able to really focus on the items that make my life more enjoyable so that I can spend more time doing the things and visiting with the people that I care about most.
We're getting emails from other people who are living in or building tiny houses who have similar motivations and some differences, too. We got a note from Brian who says, my girlfriend and I are building a tiny house in her parents' driveway this summer. A tiny house fits our life because we don't know exactly where we want to live in 5 years. We're also recent college graduates facing a terrible job market and student loan repayment. A tiny house will allow us to be mobile and simply live with few expenses while being homeowners. And Dan says that he can't actually listen to the show live at noon because he is right now building a tiny house in Bethel, so he'll be listening to the rebroadcast. He says of his house, it's 10 foot by 16 foot, the smallest footprint I could design and still squeeze in full-sized features. The outside is nearing completion, but when it's all done, it'll have a bathroom with a 4-foot clawfoot tub, apartment-sized kitchen with pantry, 6.5-foot built-in living room, couch, guest bed, a tiny wood stove, double-door closet, built-in desk, a loft big enough for a queen-size futon, and a mudroom. He says it will be insulated with 4 inches of rigid foam, so between solar gain, body heat, and a little bit of wood, it should stay snug with a minimum of effort. And Dan says he's hoping to have it finished by the end of the summer, then sell it, and maybe try to sell some plans for the design as well. Jose, Lynna came to Yes Tomorrow, where you work, to guide her in building a tiny house and learning how to design one. And I just read a couple of emails. What else are you seeing at Yes Tomorrow in terms of people coming, looking at the tiny house movement, finding some motivation there?
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of activity recently. Yes Tomorrow has been involved in the tiny house movement, I'd say, for a good 2 or 3 years now. And since we built our tiny house last fall through the semester program, there was a lot of energy around it. I had a few people offer me checks on the spot, wanting to purchase the house. And then since then, people have seen it and have been really excited about it, wanting plans. And yeah, it's just been a kind of a revolving door of people being really excited about tiny houses and how they can be involved in it.
When they talk to you about why they might want to live in a tiny house, what are they telling you?
It's a combination of 3 things, I think. One part, sort of the pragmatic and environmental or activism that Lena was talking about. But I think another part is romanticism. There's, it evokes Thoreau in The Woodland Cabin. I think there's an appeal to vernacular architecture, that is architecture without architects, that people are really excited about. The desire for self-sufficiency. There's a really great book by Michael Pollan, A Place of My Own, where he chronicles a lot of these topics. The pragmatics, in addition to what Lena mentioned before, there's also the ability to phase from the small building potentially to a larger home, as some of your writers have mentioned. And the activism and environmentalism is a big thing, wanting to live simple and with a light footprint.
Jose, I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but do you mind telling us how big is your house?
I actually live in a tiny apartment.
You do?
Yeah, so it's about 800 square foot. But, having built a few, it's got me really thinking about, the day that I do decide to build my own house, wanting it to be similarly of a light footprint and simple.
We're talking today about tiny houses and how people maneuver in a smaller space than perhaps some of us thought about when we initially thought about buying a home, living in a home. Listeners, can you imagine seriously downsizing from where you live now? How much furniture, clothing, and space do you actually need to function and be happy? Let us know what you see in tiny houses. We're going to have your calls, more of your emails coming up. Go to vpr.net/Vermont Edition or call 1-800-639-2211. I'm Jane Lindholm, and this is Vermont Edition. Today we're exploring the tiny house movement. Tiny houses are typically between 64 and 300 square feet, and people use them for all kinds of things, including permanent full-time living space. But it's not always easy to get proper permits for them, so some people are plumbing and wiring their tiny homes and setting them up a little bit under the radar. We would love to know, listeners, what you think. Have you seen a tiny house? Been invited to a dinner party in one? Could you see yourself shrinking your footprint and finding happiness in a couple hundred square feet? Let us know at 1-800-639-2211 or post on the Vermont Edition page at vpr.net. That number again is 1-800-639-2211. We're talking today with Jose Galarza, Director of Semester Programs at Yestermorrow Design Build School. He also teaches a class at Yestermorrow where students often build a tiny house. And we're also joined by Lina Menard, a Yestermorrow student who lives in a tiny house in Portland, Oregon, and is overseeing construction of a very own tiny house that she co-designed. And hearing from many of you today, Jane says, after designing and building 3 regular houses, we're now designing and building a tiny house on a trailer. The fact that it's movable helps deal with the zoning and permitting issues. Our tractor is 8 by 20, 100 square feet of living space. It will be insulated with a wood stove that will enable us to live in any climate, and we'll have all the comforts of home, lighting, propane stove with oven, refrigerator, toilet, and shower, along with a laptop computer, cell phone, and internet access. We've lived on boats for several years and are taking our experience with living in that small space and transferring it to our boat on land. Sarah Jo in Bakersfield says, our house is slightly larger, but still very small by most standards. We have about 600 square feet of livable floor space and an additional 150 plus of storage. It's allowed us some financial flexibility to explore our passions. And Megan in Burlington says, I love the idea of living in a tiny house, but I would still need separate art studio space. And she muses, does that defeat the original purpose? Again, let us know what you think at vpr.net. And let's go to Sean, who's calling in from Sudbury. Hi, Sean. Go ahead.
Hi, Jane.
Hi.
I'm wondering about the zoning thing you just alluded to. How do municipalities view these tiny houses? They're charming, but especially the ones that are not mobile on a wheeling cart. If you're going to build one of these on a full foundation permanently, how does most towns view this kind of small structures being not going to generate a whole lot of taxes?
Yeah, Sean, thanks for that question. Jose and Lina, I'll have you both answer that because I think you're dealing with it in different municipalities. But Jose, what about Sean's question about zoning and permitting?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it seems like the building codes haven't yet caught up with this movement. Hopefully they will start to create some zoning around it that supports this type of building typology. In the meantime, you just have to check in with your local building authorities and see how they might classify it. They could see it potentially as an RV, as a small cabin or shed. It's really just dependent on that individual region.
Why does the fact that it's a tiny house, a very, very small structure, seem to make it so complicated for zoning, Jose?
I think it's more the fact that when it's on a trailer, your caller was really talking about, what if you move it onto a foundation? Mm-hmm. And that's a more typical thing that a building code would be able to regulate. Once you put it on top of a trailer, at that point, it no longer becomes a building in the eyes of the sort of people in question. It becomes more a problem of the DMV. It's a vehicle or a load on a trailer. It's no longer a building.
Lina, what about for you out in Oregon? What are you seeing?
A lot of the issues that Jose brought up are very relevant here as well. When a building is constructed on a trailer, the way that many tiny houses are, it doesn't really fall under building code. So it's kind of a loophole It sometimes will fall under a zoning code if it's considered a recreational vehicle. There are often requirements regarding how long someone can live in a recreational vehicle. In some places, it's not allowed at all. But in other places, there are also maintenance code issues. So it's not possible for somebody to consider a space a habitable space if it doesn't have spaces of a certain size. And that's something that I found really interesting, that a kitchen needs to be a certain size and a bedroom needs to be a certain size. And by the time you add up cooking space and sleeping space and all these other things, you're often looking at a structure of at least 1,000 square feet. And many of us have found that we just don't need a space that large to meet our needs. So I think in a lot of places, tiny houses are what I'm calling illegal. They're not legal, but they're not illegal. So many of us have used that term as we describe it. And in a lot of cases, if they are kind of under the radar, and tiny houses are often very good neighbors, and the tiny houses are often very cute, too. So it's not usually a problem. I think some of the things that could become problems and things that we're doing a lot of research about and trying to figure out best practices for right now are things like proper gray water systems and figuring out ways to heat and cool our spaces that don't disrupt our neighbors or our neighborhoods. So I think that a lot of the issues are really about being good neighbors and being conscientious about our energy use. Sometimes people say that tiny houses don't seem very self-contained if we're not, paying our own property taxes and that sort of thing. But almost everyone I know who lives in a tiny house is renting a space to park. What they don't have is a mortgage or a requirement to be in one place forever. And that freedom and flexibility is really, really useful for a lot of people who have a more mobile lifestyle.
Well, along those lines, though, Bruce in South Burlington writes in to say, if you build a tiny house on wheels so you can travel around, why not just buy a travel trailer? Jose?
Yeah, I can't disagree with that, honestly. There are some concerns when taking this kind of home on the highway when you're reaching speeds of 60 miles an hour or more, that there's the potential for that exterior cladding to be a liability. So if it's receiving a lot of regular movement from place to place, it's a consideration worth having, potentially looking at an RV or some other alternative. I think there's also the desire among people who are building tiny houses to build their own, and it's part of that DIY or sort of homestead ethic.
We got a question from Laura who says, I've been intrigued, my husband would say obsessed, with tiny houses lately. One perception, though, is that it seems a lot of people think that tiny houses are primitive. How do you take a tiny house and make it work for a telecommuter or for the modern, fully connected family? And Danielle posts similarly on Facebook that she lived in a very, very small space when she lived in Japan, but now that she has a dog and a kid and a husband, she doesn't see how you could fit a whole family into this space. So, Lina, what about making this work for a modern family?
Sure. I think that in terms of using a small space efficiently, a really important component is high design, having a space that is designed to accommodate the needs of the people who live in it. I don't believe that it works for people to cram their lives into little tiny boxes. What I think is important is to evaluate our needs, our wants, and our priorities, and choose the smallest space that meets those needs. So it's entirely possible that a family with a couple of kids or pets, or even, just two people might decide that they need a larger space, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. We're not saying that people can't live in larger spaces. We're just saying that if it works for somebody to live in a smaller space, it's worth considering. And there are many multifunctional items that can help to make that more doable. There are people who are using Murphy beds or futons to enable themselves to have a little more floor space while still having a sleeping space. Sleeping lofts, of course, are a nice option for those who are comfortable navigating a ladder. And I think that while some of the early tiny houses, like D. Williams' tiny house, were fairly simple without running water, without without a grid-tied connection, there are many people who are incorporating some of the luxuries of life into a tiny house. I've even heard of people having a washing machine in a tiny house. So it's entirely possible. One of the things, stepping back a moment, too, to an earlier portion of the conversation about mobility, I often think of the tiny houses that are being constructed on trailers right now as mobile homes that are more home than mobile. So an RV is set up for temporary or seasonal use. It's not necessarily insulated or weatherized to be appropriate for year-round use. But a tiny house is often a little more focused on the home piece and a little less focused on mobility.
And Jose, I understand that in teaching your courses, it's not just about, the footprint of the house, but you actually try to help figure out an interior design that can really accommodate full living, despite the size, or add some of those things that Lina was talking about to make it easier to live in a smaller space.
Yeah, I think when Lina said high design, that really resonated with me. I think when we look at a tiny house, we're not, stuck in the sort of crayon drawing that we did when we were children, which was the triangle top house. We're looking at really contemporary aesthetics and looking towards technology that simplifies the ability to work from home or in tight quarters. Think a New York studio apartment, for example, in all of the innovations that have come out that allow people to live sort of well-organized, well-organized within tight spaces, while also having many amenities.
Peter wrote in to say, I think it's great that people are trying to live more simply and in smaller spaces. Americans typically use about twice as much square footage of floor area as Europeans, and much more than people in the rest of the world. However, from an environmental sustainability perspective, small single-family homes are the worst. The best would be to live in small, simple apartments in larger family multi-buildings that are more energy efficient because they have lower surface-to-volume ratio. Peter says the best would be to clump a lot of tiny houses together and create an apartment building of tiny apartments. Joseph says, I'm looking into 500 to 800 square feet of alternative home plans. I'd recommend looking into shipping container home plans as well. The tiny house is just too small. I'm 6'6" and I need some space. And let's go to Rob, who's calling in from Johnson. Hi, Rob. Go ahead.
Hi, how are you?
Great. How are you?
Good. We have a tiny house, and I would agree with your last comment that sometimes they're just too small. There's two of us that live in a 12 by 16, and if we could do it again, I think I'd just go with a regular small house. It's kind of tight.
What would a regular small house size be for you now, Rob?
1,000 to 1,200 square feet.
So do you think that it was worthwhile for you to spend some time in this tiny house, figure out what kind of space works for you?
Yes. Yeah, it's been valuable, and it's in a beautiful spot. So we've got to spend time there. And that's been really nice.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective, Rob living in a tiny house now. Emily says, my boyfriend and I have been renting a tiny house since early spring, about 400 square feet. One noticeable perk that I've encountered that hasn't been mentioned on the program is the time it takes to clean a tiny house, which for me averages about 30 minutes for the entire living space. For those with a busy lifestyle, this can mean a lot more time to relax at home. And Steve in Underhill says, my wife and I lived in a 12 by 20, 240 square foot, one-story cabin for 5 years while we saved money for our small, but admittedly not tiny, passive solar insulated house in Norwich. It was a challenge living in such a small space, which wasn't anywhere near as well designed as today's tiny houses. But living lightly on the earth has always been one of my life goals, and living in a tiny house gave me the opportunity to put into practice many of my ideals. If I ever build another house, it will be a tiny house that uses no non-renewable energy at all. And let's go to Nina, calling in from East Hoosick, New York. Hey, Nina, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much. Oh, well, I have a tiny house, but I don't, which is already built. I actually had it built for a storage space, but I had it built so that it could eventually be lived in. However, my questions are these. What about heating and water? So if somebody goes away for a couple of days, the wood stove won't work. You have to have a source that's going to keep the pipes from freezing. And then what about bringing water into that? And I also, just apart from that, I want to know if the people who called in with their great ideas, can we access them through Vermont Edition? And also, how do we find Yestermorrow Design? So thanks so much.
Sure, Nina. Let me answer a couple of those questions. First of all, people who are writing in, if you go to vpr.net/Vermont Edition, there's a whole discussion forum, and you can communicate with people there. Try to get together, maybe find a group so you can all work on your tiny houses. And we also have a link to Yestermorrow right there, so you can find out more about the design classes that they have. Jose, we just have a couple of minutes left, but Nina was asking about water and how do you make heat and water work?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge in the New England climate, especially when it comes to freezing. In the last house we built, we just had a connection to a hose bib, a sort of very typical connection that you would have outside of your house. But that means that it's not a four-season shelter for water. So that makes it a challenge unless you insulate that or connect it directly to a well. So you could set that up to be hooked up onto a foundation, at which point it would be totally fine. But as it's on a trailer, it still remains a challenge. Wood stove, I've heard that mentioned often throughout the show, and it just brings up a concern for me, which is indoor air quality. I just want to make sure that people are really thinking about if they're creating a tight box that is passively heated because they want to have good insulation, they're not at the same time creating a problem by generating all that smoke within their space. And so in our building, we actually put electric kick space heaters because we knew we'd be able to generate electricity through solar PV panels. So these are different things to look at and think about. In the case of the kick space heater, it's something that you can just turn on automatically, and it will sort of self-regulate. Wood stove makes that a little more challenging.
Well, this has been so interesting to learn more about tiny houses. I wish we had more time for it. And, Lina, it's been very interesting to hear you talk as well about some of what living in a tiny house embodies beyond just the physical space. So, Jose Galarza, Lina Menard, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Jose Galarza is Director of Semester Programs at Yestermorrow Design Build School. We do have a link to that at vpr.net. Click on Vermont Edition. Lina Menard lives in a tiny house in Portland, Oregon, where she's currently overseeing construction of another tiny house that she co-designed. She's also working on a certification through Yestermorrow. Coming up, the band Chamberlain gets us moving with live music from the VPR Performance Studio. This is Vermont Edition. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Jane Lindholm, and I'm now in VPR's Performance Studio, where I'm joined by the band Chamberlain. Guys, thank you so much for coming in. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And you are actually announcing your U.S. tour today, but before we hear about some of the new projects, I want to get right into the music because that's what you're really here for. So Ethan West, guitarist and vocalist, what's the first song you guys are going to play for us?
It's called Maryland. It's kind of a letter to a state.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, let's hear it. That was the song Maryland. We're joined in VPR's performance studio by an appreciative audience and members of the band Chamberlain. It was a great, great song. It's from their new upcoming EP, Look What I've Become. And we are joined today by Mark Daly, Ethan West, Jamie Hines, Chuck Whistler, and Leon Campos. Guys, that was terrific. Although, you know, this is Vermont edition. If you were going to do an ode to a song, shouldn't it have been
right,
an ode to Vermont? Right, we should have
switched it at the last minute.
You have, though.
It doesn't have the ring to it. Yeah.
No, it doesn't. It's easier to rhyme to Maryland, too, as well. You guys have had a lot of support, fellowship, and mentorship, though, from other Vermont musicians, Grace Potter and the Nocturnals, Luke Reynolds. What has it been like to have that kind of, perhaps mentorship, but certainly support and fellowship?
It's been really, really great. We all love Vermont. It's like, you know, coming off the road and coming back to Vermont is like the greatest feeling ever. So just to have people in the state who like us and want to work with us it's really nice.
I understand that you guys all live in a cabin together.
Yeah, it's kind of our base of operations.
We've been talking about tiny houses. Is this like a tiny cabin for you guys?
It's not tiny, but yeah, no, we all fit in there. We try not to get on each other's nerves, but yeah, it's kind of, we can go down there and write songs and record versions of the song as soon as we write them and practice and rehearse and try not to annoy the neighbors and that type of thing. So.
Barely any neighbors.
Yeah.
You don't have any neighbors?
Well, we're on the side of the mountain, so the sound reflects into the valley. So.
Oh, so it sounds great for your neighbors.
Yeah,
then.
Exactly. So I think the whole valley, the whole Champlain Valley can hear us.
It really is the perfect place to retreat and just write music and be in like a really nice space.
Well, let's hear another song since we're talking music. What do you want to play next?
I think Jealousy. Yeah.
Hollow scorn, you're not welcome anymore. You take my hand and twist my wrist. My burning head keeps my bitter fire fed. I know I am better than this. Jealousy, look what I've become. Oh, jealousy, broken, bruising on. Straying eyes, holding tears she's yet to cry. Envy's glare has left me blind. Anxious bones leave my crawling skin alone. It does not fit, it is not mine. Jealousy, look what I've become.
That was Jealousy from the band Chamberlain. They're live at VPR's Performance Studio. I love that song. It's just great. I'm hoping, though, you can tell us a little bit more about the background for that song and some of the interpersonal stuff that's been swirling around for you guys in the last year and a half or so, Ethan.
You know, Jealousy, we wrote that song. Jealousy is pretty universal. It's something everybody experiences, and it's not
basic, guys. We all do.
Yeah, it's not an appealing part of any person's personality, so it's kind of a way to get over that and try not to be so jealous, was to write a song about it, and I think it helped a little bit, you know.
Well, it sounds like the band has gone through a little bit of turmoil over the last year and a half or so. I mentioned you are all living in a cabin together now, which means you have a lot of personal time together.
Definitely. We chose to record the EP in kind of a different way, in a kind of a unique way, where we worked with some different people, and we left Vermont. We'd never recorded outside of Vermont, so we went down to Nashville and recorded it down there. And it was tough and it was hard, but we got through it, and we're all really, really happy with how it turned out. And we're all, as you said, in the cabin writing our next record, and so it's great.
You write on your Facebook page, the irony of a band writing an EP about jealousy and cheating only to cheat on each other to make it does not go unnoticed in this group of close friends.
Yeah, we all have senses of humor about it.
Yeah, well, you'd
right,
have to be now. Yeah, you can't see them, but they're nodding, but probably shooting arrows at
there's some looks. There's some looks.
Your U.S. tour is actually kicking off August 10th in Burlington at Signal Kitchen, and you're working on a full album, I understand, for the spring of 2013.
Right, yep.
What's it going to be called? Do you know yet?
Oh, we don't know. That comes later. We have to write the songs first.
Well, we have been thrilled to hear some of these songs. We've been listening to the Vermont band Chamberlain. Again, lead singer Mark Daly, guitarist Ethan West, Jamie Heinz on drums, Chuck Whistler on bass, and today they were accompanied by keyboardist Leon Campos. They've been playing live for us. We're going to say goodbye to them, but then we're going to hear some more music from them. So first of all, I just want to say, guys, thank you so much for performing for us today. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
And before we let you go, Ethan, the song "Thief" that we're going to hear, just give us a little tidbit on what
right.
It's
a darker song about we're on the road a lot, and just being on the road and having people back home that you miss and having them on your mind constantly. So we kind of wrote that as a way to deal with that.
Well, we're going to hear "Thief." This is going to take us out for the end of the show. I'm Jane Lindholm. You've been listening to Vermont Edition. I want to thank VPR's John Billingsley for engineering today. Thank you all so much for listening, and here's "Thief."
Took more than mine. Whoa, we all seem so unclear. Feels like I'm looking in a broken mirror. I had to leave. It's not my choice. I hear the pain. Shake your voice. Distances are nothing new. Growing weary of missing you. Back to you instead. I have to go. You have to stay.